He was putting the nozzle back when he heard it. Not the words yet. The footsteps first. The specific sound of someone walking toward him with intention, not passing through, not going to the convenience store, but coming to him, and the sound of it made him turn the way a man turns when he has been paying attention to how people move through spaces for long enough that direction of intention is something he reads without deciding to read it. The young man was in his mid-20s. Dark hair. Work coat. He was walking from the direction of the blue pickup truck 2 pumps over, and he was walking the way people walk when they have been gathering their nerve for a while and have finally used it all up and are now in motion before the nerve runs out. He stopped 4 feet away. He said, "Excuse me, sir." The big man said, "Yeah." The young man looked at him. He looked at the cut, the patches, the Hells Angels bottom rocker, the chapter emblem. He looked at the man's face. He said, "Is your name Roe?" The big man went still. Not the stillness of surprise, the deeper stillness of a man who has been called by a name in a context that cannot immediately be explained, and whose mind is running fast behind a face that is not moving. He said, "Where'd you hear that name?" The young man reached into his coat pocket. He took out his phone. He showed the big man a photograph. The big man looked at it for a long time without speaking. Then the young man said the words that would stay with Everett Roe Calder for the rest of his life. He said, "Sir, your name is on my mother's grave." The gas station on Route 441 in Rabun County, Georgia, made no particular sound in that moment. The pumps ran. A car went past on the highway. The morning birds in the tree line above the station were going about their morning business without interruption. Roe Calder stood at Pump 7 and did not move. He had been called by that name for 31 years. It had been given to him by a man he had never seen again and had never expected to hear outside the chapter. His real name, Everett, he had not used since he was 23. He was 54 now. He had ridden 250,000 miles under that name, and under the patch, and under everything that went with them. He had done things he was proud of, and things he was not. He had kept moving the way a man keeps moving when the alternative is sitting still long enough to be found by the things that are looking for you. He had not, in 31 years, been found by this. He said, "Tell me." The Route 441 fuel stop sat 3 miles south of the Georgia-North Carolina line in Rabun County, at the point where Route 441 came down out of the mountains and began to open up toward the valley. It was the first gas station on the Georgia side, and the last on the North Carolina side, depending on which direction you were traveling. And this dual status gave it a steady traffic of people who had either been driving mountains and needed fuel, or were about to drive mountains and needed fuel, which was a reliable customer base in a county where the distances between things were measured in ridge lines rather than miles. The station was a practical building, 4 pumps, a convenience store that sold the usual inventory plus locally made sourwood honey and pickled rhubarb from a farm 2 hollers over, and a laminated map of the county's hiking trails that the owner, a woman named Dottie Ragsdale, had produced herself in 1998 and updated by hand every spring. The mountains were visible from the lot on the north side, the Blue Ridge going up in long folds. The ridges dark with fir and spruce, and the particular deep blue that gave them their name, a blue that was not the sky's blue but its own, something produced by the height and the haze and the specific mix of forest and stone. The morning of the 3rd Saturday in September was the kind of morning that the Rabun County mountains produced in their season. Clear, cold at 6, warming fast, the light coming over the eastern ridge in a flat angle that made everything it touched specific and sharp. The chrome at Pump 7, the pine needles on the edge of the lot, the hand on a young man's phone showing a photograph. Roe Calder had been riding since 4 in the morning from Gainesville, which was 5 hours south. He was heading to Asheville, North Carolina, where the chapter was gathering for a weekend that happened every September in the mountains, and that he had attended for 17 years, with the exception of 2. The year his knee had been rebuilt, and the year Carol was dying. He had been at the Route 441 fuel stop 11 times in 17 years, always at this point in the drive, always for the same reason: the mountains were about to start, and the tank needed to be full before they did. He was 54 years old. 6'2", 247 pounds in the broad-shouldered, thick-chested way of a man who had been large since his 20s, and had not gotten thinner with age so much as denser. The accumulated weight of decades of outdoor work and chapter riding, and the specific physical presence of a man who had learned early that his size was a language other people read before he spoke, and who had spent 31 years making sure the language said the right things. He had a gray beard worn close and a shaved head, and 2 parallel scars on the back of his right hand from a fence wire in 2007. And he wore his cut over a black long sleeve, and his riding boots were the ones he had resoled twice. He was chapter vice president. Had been for 6 years, after 12 as road captain and 4 as sergeant at arms before that. His president was a man named Dutch Garland, who had been in the chapter since before Roe, and who had given Roe the name in 2003, when Roe had pulled Dutch's Road King out of a ditch on a wet March night outside Gainesville, and had stayed to fix the rear tire in the rain without being asked. Dutch had said, "You're like a Roe deer. You show up quiet, and you move before anyone knows you were there." The name had stuck, the way names stick when they are accurate. Roe. He had been Roe since 2003. He had been the chapter's quiet constant since before that, the one who showed up and stayed and fixed things without accounting for it. He had learned this habit from a woman he had known for 3 months in the summer of 1994, and he had not thought about her in several years, and he was about to think about her for the rest of his life. Before we find out whose name is on that grave, subscribe right now and drop your city in the comments. I read every one. City, state, wherever in the world you're watching from. Now, back to Route 441. Because the young man at Pump 7 was about to tell Everett Calder something that 30 years of riding had not prepared him for. His name was Theo Marsh. He was 26 years old. He had driven 4 hours from Greenville, South Carolina, the previous evening, and had stayed at the motel in Clayton, and had been on Route 441, heading north at 7 in the morning, because he had a specific purpose and a specific destination, and he had been carrying both of them for 3 months, since the day he had helped his aunt sort through his mother's belongings and had found, in the cedar box in the bottom drawer of her dresser, a letter. The letter was addressed to no one. It was written in his mother's handwriting, the handwriting he knew from birthday cards and grocery lists, and the notes she had tucked into his lunch bag until he was old enough to find them embarrassing, which was 6th grade, and which he had found embarrassing at the time and had thought about every day since she died. The handwriting he would know anywhere. It was dated September 2003. It was 2 pages long. He had read it 3 times in his aunt's living room, and then he had sat with it in his lap for 40 minutes without speaking, and his aunt had come in with tea and had sat across from him and had not asked, because she had known what was in the cedar box and had been waiting for this moment for 3 months and had thought it would be harder than it was. It had not been hard. It had been like a door opening into a room he had not known was there. His mother's name was Helen Marsh. She had died in February of this year, 62 years old, of a cancer that had been fast and final, in the way of some cancers, giving no long runway for goodbye. Diagnosed in October, gone in February. 4 months between the word and the end. She had been a dental hygienist for 30 years at a practice in Greenville. She had raised Theo and his sister Becca alone, from the time Theo was 6 and Becca was 4, after their father left for a situation he had found preferable to being a father. She had been, in Theo's assessment, the most competent person he had ever known. Not glamorously, not dramatically, but in the deep-seated way of someone who has looked at what is required and has simply done it, without requiring acknowledgement or keeping any particular count. She had one quality he had found inexplicable when he was young and had come to understand when he was older. On 3 occasions that he could specifically remember, and probably more that he had not been old enough to notice, when things had been at their worst, when the money was tight and the car was wrong and the situation was pressing, she had been helped by a stranger. Not in a systematic way, not by any organization or program, just a person, once a woman, twice a man, who had seen something and had done something, and his mother had let them, and afterward had mentioned it the way she mentioned things that mattered, quietly, once, so that it would not be overweighted by ceremony, but would still be in the record. He had asked her once, when he was 15, why she always said yes when strangers offered to help. Most people he knew said no, reflexively, out of pride or suspicion, or the specific pride that presents as suspicion, she had said, because they went to the trouble of offering. The least I can do is accept the trouble they went to. She had not explained this further. He had not asked her to. He had stored it in the record. The letter in the cedar box was about the time in the summer of 1994 when the alternator in the Honda had failed on Highway 17 in Beaufort County, South Carolina. On a day when Theo was 2 years old and Becca was not yet born, and Helen was 8 months pregnant and alone in the car in the July heat and had not had enough battery left to run the air conditioning, and had had enough battery left for one call. She had called her mother. Her mother had said she would come, but it would be 2 hours. The letter described what happened in those 2 hours. Roe held the phone. He looked at the photograph on the screen. It was a gravestone, gray granite, simple, the kind that said what needed to be said without requiring flourish. Helen Louise Marsh. The dates. Below the dates, in the space where some stones carry a scripture verse or a single word or a line of poetry, this stone had something else. It had 2 lines. The first line said, "She let strangers help her." The second line said, one of them was called Roe. He stood at pump 7 with the phone in his hand and read the second line a second time. He said, "I don't." He stopped. Theo said, "She wrote a letter. She left it in a cedar box. She wrote it in 2003, right after she got the stone. She wanted to put your name on it and she put it on, and then she wrote the letter about why." He paused. "She didn't send it to anyone. I don't think she knew how to find you." Roe said, "What did it say?" Theo said, "That you stopped on Highway 17, summer of 1994. She was pregnant and the car had died and she was alone." Roe was quiet. Theo said, "She said you stayed for 2 hours. You fixed the alternator. You wouldn't take money. She said you went into the service station and bought her a cold drink and a snack, and you put them on the seat beside her before she could argue." He paused. "She said the cold drink was orange Fanta because she had mentioned that morning sickness made her want something sweet and orange, and you had remembered." Roe looked at the mountain line above the trees. He had done this. He knew he had done this. Not this specifically. Not the specific day or the specific woman or the specific orange Fanta, but he had done this kind of thing. He had been doing this kind of thing since before he had a name for it, and before the chapter, and before the patches. He had been the man who stopped. His father had been the man who stopped. He had learned it without being taught it, because some things are transmitted through observation without instruction. He could not pull the specific day out of 31 years of roads. 1994. Highway 17. A woman in a Honda. Pregnant. July heat. He had been 23 years old. He had been riding between Beaufort and Charleston on chapter business he could not now recall. He had seen the car on the shoulder. He had stopped. He had fixed it. He had gone to the service station for the Fanta. He had not taken money, because taking money was not the transaction. He had not thought about it again. 31 years of not thinking about it, and here, on the second line of a stone in a Greenville cemetery, it had been waiting. He said, "What was her name?" Theo said, "Helen Marsh." Roe said the name quietly to himself. He was testing whether it produced a memory that was specific. It did not. He had the shape of the day, the heat, the shoulder, the car, but not her face. He was honest with himself about this. He said, "I don't remember her face." Theo said, "She remembered yours." He handed back the phone. He leaned against the pump housing and looked at the mountains. He looked at the Blue Ridge going north into North Carolina, the specific blue of it in the morning light, the color that was not the sky's color but its own. He said, "Is she? When did she?" Theo said, "February, 4 months after the diagnosis." Rose said, "I'm sorry." Theo said, "She was 62. Rose said, "I'm still sorry." They stood at pump 7 for a moment. A car came in off the highway and went to pump 2, and a man got out and started filling, and did not look at them, and the morning went on in its ordinary way around the specific stillness of 2 men at a pump. Rose said, "Why are you here?" "How did you?" Theo said. "The letter had one detail about you. It said you had a patch that said Gainesville. Not the Hells Angels patch. She mentioned that separately. She said there was a chapter patch that said Gainesville, Florida." He paused. "I looked. I found the chapter. I called the number on the website. A man named Dutch told me there was one member who went by Roe, and that he came through Robin County every September heading to Asheville." He paused again. He said to look for him at the Route 441 fuel stop. Roe was quiet for a long moment. He said, "Dutch knew." Theo said, "He said he didn't know the specifics. He said he told me where to find you because if someone's mother put your name on her grave, you should know about it." Roe looked at the mountains. He thought about Dutch Garland, who had been in the chapter since before Roe, who had given him the name in a rain-wet ditch outside Gainesville, who had been his president for 22 years, and who had apparently been fielding calls from strangers about him and routing them to a gas station in Rabun County without mentioning it. He said, "How long have you been trying to find me?" Theo said, 3 months. "Since I found the letter." Rose said, "You drove from Greenville." Theo said, "Yes, sir." Rose said, "Last night?" Theo said, "Stayed in Clayton." Roe looked at him. He looked at this young man who had driven 4 hours and stayed at a motel in Clayton and gotten up early and waited at a gas station in the mountains because his mother had put a name on a stone and he had decided the name deserved to know. He said, "What did you need from me?" Theo said, "Nothing." Roe said, "Then why?" Theo looked at the mountains for a moment. He said, "She used to say that people who do the right thing should know it mattered. She said the people who stop never find out what the stopping meant." He paused. "She put your name on her grave because you mattered enough to put there. I thought you should know." He thought about Helen Marsh. He had not thought about her in 31 years because he had not had her face to think of, but she had thought about him. She had written 2 pages about a July afternoon in 1994, and she had put his name on granite. And she had left a letter in a cedar box addressed to no one because she had not known how to find him, and had held on to it anyway because holding on to things is what people do when they believe the thing is worth the holding. He thought about the orange Fanta. He had not thought about an orange Fanta in 31 years. He thought about it now with the specific clarity of a detail that has been held in someone else's memory for 31 years and has just been returned to you. And the detail was exact. Morning sickness. Something sweet and orange. He had gone to the service station and remembered and come back with it. He had not thought of it as kindness. He had thought of it as information. She had said something. He had retained it. He had acted on it. That was not heroism. That was just paying attention. And yet here was a stone with his name on it. He said, "Does your sister know you came?" Theo said, "Yes." Rose said, "What did she say?" Theo said, "She said Mom would have loved that you're in the Hells Angels." Something moved in Ro Calder's face. Not a smile exactly, the specific shift that happens when something unexpected lands in a register you were not prepared for. And the surprise of it opens a feeling you had been managing carefully, and the feeling gets out briefly before you bring it back. He said, "She would have?" Theo said, "She had a thing for people who weren't what they looked like." Ro said, "That sounds right." They stood at Pump 7. The morning had warmed by now. The early cold was gone, and the September sun was on the pavement, and the chrome and the mountains were the specific blue of a clear mountain morning that is going to be a perfect day. Ro said, "Can I see the letter?" Theo said, "I printed a copy." I thought. He went to his truck. He came back with a folded envelope. He held it out. Ro took it. He did not open it. He held it with both hands and looked at it and said, "Thank you." Theo said, "Thank you." For 1994. Rose said, "I would have done it for anyone." Theo said, "I know." That's what she wrote. The call to Dutch went out at 7:43, not a text. A call which was unusual. Ro communicated by text the way most people in the chapter communicated by text, and a call at 7:43 on a Saturday morning was its own kind of signal. Dutch answered on the second ring. He said, "You found him." Ro said, "You could have told me." Dutch said, "I could have, but he needed to tell you himself." Ro was quiet for a moment. He said, "You've known about the stone." Dutch said, 3 months, since the boy called." A pause. "I called a few of the others, in case you needed company." Ro said, "What does that mean?" Dutch said, "It means drive careful. The road's going to be busier than you think this morning." He ended the call before Ro could ask what he meant. Ro looked at Theo. He said, "Are you heading north or south?" Theo said, "North. I was going to find the cemetery in Highlands. She's buried up here. She wanted to be in the mountains." Ro said, "I'll ride with you part of the way." Theo looked at him. He said, "You don't have to." Ro said, "I know." Engines. They started before Ro had gone 2 miles. He heard them behind him first, the sound he knew before he knew anything else about the morning, the sound that had been the context of 31 years of roads. He checked his mirror. 3 bikes. Then, in his next check, 7, coming up Route 441 from the Georgia side, not fast, not formation exactly. Loose. The way bikers ride when they are heading somewhere together, but the formation is not the point. The together is the point. He called Dutch. Dutch said, "There's about 30 coming from Georgia. 12 from North Carolina. They'll be on 441 by 8. Ro said, "How?" Dutch said, "I called a few of the others." Ro said, "You said that." Dutch said, "They called a few of theirs." Ro said, "Dutch?" Dutch said, "A woman put your name on her grave." You think the chapter doesn't want to be somewhere for that? Roe said nothing for a moment. Dutch said, "Ride." He rode. In the blue pickup truck ahead of him, Theo Marsh drove north on Route 441 toward the North Carolina mountains and his mother's grave in Highlands. And he watched in his rearview mirror as the road behind the motorcycle grew. He had not expected this. He had driven 4 hours and stayed at a motel in Clayton for a conversation at a gas station. And now the road behind the man he had found was filling with motorcycles that were coming from directions he had not anticipated. And he drove and watched his mirror and did not fully understand what he was seeing, but understood enough. They came in the way that chapter members come when they have been called, for something that is not an emergency and is not a confrontation, but is something that requires being somewhere because someone you know is there. And the being somewhere is the only contribution available, and it is sufficient. They came from Gainesville and from Athens and from Asheville and from 4 roads that intersected with Route 441 between the Georgia line and Highlands, and they came without announcement and without coordination except the coordination that 31 years of brotherhood produces, which looks from the outside like coincidence and is not. 44 motorcycles came up into the North Carolina mountains on a September Saturday morning. Not a procession, a gathering that was moving. A group that had somewhere to be and was going there together. The way groups go somewhere together when the going matters more than the arriving. The Highland Hills Cemetery sat on a slope above the town, which was the appropriate position for a cemetery in the mountains. The dead looking down at the living in the way of places where the separation between those two categories is made visible by elevation. The lot held a dozen cars on a Saturday morning. Families at headstones. A groundskeeper with a push mower working along the far fence. And then, between 9:15 and 9:30, it held 44 motorcycles, parked along the cemetery road in the careful way of men who have come to a place that requires a certain kind of quiet and intend to provide it. They did not go to the grave in a group. They stayed at the road. Roe went to the grave. Theo walked beside him. The stone was gray granite, simple, the kind that said what it said. Roe had seen it in the photograph. He knew what was on it. He stood in front of it anyway and read both lines. She let strangers help her. One of them was called Roe. He stood there for a long time. He thought about Highway 17 in July 1994. He thought about a car on a shoulder and a woman 8 months pregnant in the heat, and a service station and an orange Fanta. He thought about all the roads since then, the 250,000 miles and the 31 years, and all the people he had stopped for and had not stopped for, and the math of that, which was not a math you could do and which was not the point. The point was on the stone. He had done one thing, one ordinary thing, one act of paying attention on a July afternoon, and someone had held it for 31 years and had decided it was worth the granite. He had not known. You never know. That was the fact of it. The unadorned fact that he stood in front of a stone in Highland Hills Cemetery and received like weather. You never know which of the ordinary things will be held, and by whom, and for how long, and what it will mean to them. You cannot do the ordinary things with an accounting in mind, because the accounting is not available. You can only do them because they are the right things to do, and because your father did them, and because somewhere along the way you learned, without being formally taught, that stopping is the available thing, and that the available thing is the one you do. He had stopped in 1994. He had driven away. He had not thought about it again. And here was his name. Theo stood beside him. He did not speak. He had done the thing he came to do. He had found the name on his mother's stone, and he had given it the news. And now he stood beside this man in the September mountain morning and looked at the stone with him. Because standing beside someone who is receiving something large is sometimes the full extent of what is needed. After a while, Rose said, "She sounds like someone." Theo said, "She was." Rose said, "I'm glad she had a good life." Theo said, "She did. She had us." Ro looked at the stone. He said, "She was right about one thing." Theo said, "What's that?" Ro said, "People who do the right thing should know it mattered." He paused. "I didn't know. Now I do." He reached into his jacket. He took out the folded envelope, the printed letter, 2 pages. The handwriting he had not seen before and would know for the rest of his life. He held it. He said, "Tell me about her." "While we're here." Theo told him. He told him for 20 minutes, standing at the stone in the Highland Hill Cemetery, about Helen Marsh, who had been a dental hygienist for 30 years, and who had raised 2 children alone, and who had said yes when strangers offered to help, and who had bought sourwood honey whenever she came through the mountains because she thought life was too short to buy the regular kind, and who had a laugh that started as a breath and grew into something that made other people laugh before they knew what was funny. Ro listened the way he listened, fully, without the restless quality of a man waiting for a pause. He listened to a woman he had not known be given to him in 20 minutes by her son on a September morning in the mountains, and he received her the way you receive things that arrive late but arrive whole. When Theo finished, Ro said, "She was right about you too." Theo said, "What do you mean?" Ro said, "She raised someone who drove 4 hours and stayed in a motel in Clayton to find a stranger's name on a stone. That's her." Theo looked at the stone for a moment. He said, "I guess it is." They stood with Helen Marsh for another minute in the September morning. Then they walked back to the road. 44 men were waiting at the cemetery road, not in any formation, not doing anything except being present in the way that the framework of 31 years of brotherhood produces, at ease, quiet. The specific, unself-conscious patience of men who have come a long way for something and are not in a hurry about the arrival. Ro came back to the road, and they were there. And he stopped and looked at them for a moment. Dutch Garland was at the front. He was 61 years old and had been in the chapter since 1988, and he had the face of a man who has seen a great deal and has classified most of it as worth seeing. He looked at Ro and said nothing. Ro said, "You called a few of the others." Dutch said, "A few." Ro said, 44 is not a few, Dutch. Dutch said, "I've always had trouble with quantities." Ro looked at the 44. He looked at the cemetery road and the mountains above it and the blue ridge going north in the late morning light, blue and specific and there. He looked at Theo, who was standing to his right with his hands in his coat pockets, reading the men the way someone reads a landscape they have not been in before, carefully, without reaching for a conclusion. He looked at Dutch. He said, "Her name was Helen Marsh." Dutch said, "Tell us." Ro told them. He told them about Highway 17 in July 1994, and about an orange Fanta, and about 2 lines on a gray granite stone, and about a son who had driven 4 hours and stayed at a motel in Clayton, because he believed the name deserved to know. He told it the way he told things, without embellishment, in the flat chronological order of a man who has learned that the facts of a thing are sufficient and require no decoration. When he finished, the road was quiet. Dutch said, "She had it right." Ro said, "Yeah." Dutch said, "You should have seen your face at that pump." Ro said, "I'm glad no one was watching." Dutch said, 44 people were watching." Ro looked at him. Dutch looked at the mountains. His face had the specific quality of a man who is very pleased with himself and is not going to acknowledge it directly. Theo said, "There's something else." Everyone looked at him. He said, "She put something in the letter. For whoever found Roe." He reached into his coat. He took out a second envelope, smaller, sealed, his mother's handwriting on the front. It said, "For Roe, when you find him." He held it out. Roe took it. He looked at the handwriting. He looked at the mountains. He put it in his jacket pocket, inside, against his chest. He said, "I'll read it on the road." He got on the Road King. 43 engines answered his. He pulled out of the Highland Hills Cemetery parking lot onto the mountain road, and the formation gathered around him. Not in front, not behind, around, the way people ride when the riding is not about destination but about company, and they came down out of the mountains together on a September Saturday with the sun at full height and the Blue Ridge going blue and specific on both sides of the road, and the air cold and clear and smelling of pine and granite and the particular clean of high altitude in early autumn. At the bottom of the mountain, where Route 441 opened up and the valley spread out, Roe pulled over. The formation pulled over with him. He took the letter from his pocket. He opened it. He read it there, on the shoulder of Route 441, with 43 engines ticking as they cooled around him, and the valley below, and the mountains above, and the September light on everything. He read it twice. He put it back in his pocket. He did not say what it said. He did not need to. Whatever Helen Marsh had written in 1994, and sealed in an envelope addressed to a man she could not find, was between the two of them. And the road, and the stone that would hold his name for as long as granite holds anything which is long enough. He started the Road King. He rode south. There is a grave in the mountains of North Carolina with a name on it that most people reading the stone will not recognize. They will read the first line, "She let strangers help her," and they will understand it because they will have seen it in someone they knew or hoped it was true of themselves. And then they will read the second line, and they will wonder who Roe was and what he did, and whether he ever knew. He knows now. He has known since a September morning at a gas station on Route 441, when a young man walked across a parking lot with his nerve used up and said 5 words to a large man at a fuel pump. And the large man went still, and the world got a little more right than it had been before. You stop for people because it is the right thing to do, and because your father did it. And because the alternative is driving past. You stop because you are going 20 miles an hour in a school zone, and you stop because the hazard lights have been blinking too long, and you stop because a child is standing at a gate, and you stop because a woman on a hospital bench says, "Just sit with me, please." You stop because stopping is the available thing. And sometimes, decades later, on a stone in the mountains, the stopping is still there. It does not require witnesses. It does not require gratitude. It requires nothing except the doing of it and the willingness to keep doing it without account. But once, just once, on a September morning in Rabun County, it is good to know. If this story reached you, share it with someone who stops for people and has never been thanked for it. Tell them it matters. Tell them it has always mattered. Hit like. Subscribe so you never miss the next story. And drop a comment. Have you ever done something for a stranger and she was standing at the gate when Lenny Barr came out to check the lock at 7:30 in the evening? He almost missed her. She was small, 8 years old. He would learn later. But small for it, the kind of small that makes adults do a second look. And she was standing to the right of the gatepost, where the shadow from the overhead light fell thickest, which was perhaps not coincidence. because she had the particular stillness of a child who has learned to wait without drawing attention. She had a yellow rain jacket that was 2 sizes too large for her, the hood down despite the light October drizzle, and a backpack on both shoulders, and a folded piece of paper held against her chest with both hands. She looked up at Lenny. Lenny looked at her. He had been doing the evening lock check at the Roanoke Chapter Clubhouse for 9 years, and he had seen a great many things at the gate over those 9 years. He had not seen this. "Hey," he said. "Hi," she said. "You lost?" he said. She shook her head. She looked at the paper in her hands. She looked back at him. "My dad said you would help me," she said. Lenny looked at the gate, then at the child, then at the empty street behind her, which held no car, no adult, nothing that explained how she had arrived. "Your dad," he said. "Yes," she said. "Who's your dad?" She told him the name. Lenny had been with the Roanoke chapter for 14 years, and he had never heard that name in his life. He stood very still for a moment. She said it again, the original sentence, not the name, the sentence, with the particular steady conviction of a child who has been told something is true by someone she trusts completely and is not going to stop believing it, because the first adult she told it to looked confused. "My dad said you would help me." Lenny opened the gate. What they would find over the next 6 hours, about the girl, about the name she had given him, about the man who had sent her here and why, would move through the chapter like a current. Some of the men would need to sit down. One of them would not speak for the better part of 20 minutes. And by the time the night was over, every member of the Roanoke chapter would understand something about who they were that they had not fully known before a small girl in an oversized yellow jacket arrived at their gate in the rain. The Roanoke Chapter Clubhouse sat on a gravel road off Plantation Road in the northwest part of the city, where the residential streets gave way to light industrial, and then to nothing in particular. And the nothing in particular was why the chapter had been here for 31 years. Enough space, enough quiet, enough distance from the kind of proximity that generated the kind of complaints that generated the kind of attention that nobody needed. The building had been a machine shop in a previous life, and the bones of that were still visible in the high ceiling and the wide doors and the concrete floor that had been painted and repainted over the years until the original gray was irretrievable. There was a kitchen that had been added in 1999 and a back room with a table that had seen the kind of conversations that did not happen anywhere else, and along the main wall there were photographs, some framed, some tacked, some laminated against the years, that ran from 1971 to the present, a visual archive of the chapter's life that nobody had ever formally curated, but that nobody had ever taken down either. It was October, and the weather had gone to drizzle after a dry week, and the air outside smelled like wet gravel and the particular smell of fall in Virginia, which is wood smoke, and something faintly sweet from the leaves coming down on the ridge above the city. Inside, 6 members had been in the main room since 5:30, a regular Thursday evening, nothing official. The kind of gathering that happened because the clubhouse was there, and it was a Thursday, and nobody had anywhere better to be. Lenny Barr was the chapter's sergeant-at-arms. He was 53 years old, from Roanoke originally, the son of a man who had worked at the Norfolk and Western, and a mother who had taught 2nd grade for 30 years, which perhaps explained why he was the one who did the evening lock check without being asked, and also the one who kept the coffee running, and also the one who, at 7:30 on a Thursday in October, was the first person to see the girl at the gate. He was 48 years old when he joined the chapter. He had spent 8 years before that as a social worker for the city of Roanoke, working in family services, before the caseload and the system had taken more from him than he could keep replacing. He had left the job, but not the instinct, which was the instinct to look at a child in a parking lot or a doorway or a gate and understand immediately what was wrong and what was needed, and in what order. He had that instinct at 7:30 on a Thursday, and it was telling him several things at once, the most important of which was, get her inside and get her warm and find out what is actually happening before you make any other decisions. He brought her in. Before we get to what the chapter found when they looked up her father's name, drop your city in the comments right now, wherever you're watching from. Your city, your state, anywhere in the world. I want to see how far this story travels. Hit subscribe so you never miss the next one. I read every comment. Now, back to that clubhouse in Roanoke. Back to the girl in the yellow jacket and the piece of paper she had carried all the way here. Because what was written on that paper would change every man in that room. Her name was Rosie Callahan. She was 8 years old, and she had gotten off a city bus at the stop on Plantation Road and walked the half-mile to the gate by herself, in the dark and the drizzle, using the map her father had drawn on the back of an envelope and which she had been carrying in her jacket pocket for 2 weeks. She had practiced the walk once before, in daylight with her father, who had driven the route slowly and made her memorize the turns. She had memorized them. When she arrived at the gate, she had been walking for 11 minutes, and her shoes were wet at the toes, and she was not crying. She sat at the kitchen table in the Roanoke chapter clubhouse with a glass of chocolate milk that a man named D had made her without asking. He had simply gone to the kitchen when she sat down, and a plate of crackers that another man had brought from somewhere, and she answered the questions that Lenny asked her in the careful, deliberate way of a child who has been told what to say and has rehearsed it. Her father had given her the piece of paper 3 weeks ago. It had the chapter's address on the front, written in pen, and on the back a note in the same handwriting that said, "These are good men. They will know what to do. You can trust them." That was all it said. She also had a photograph. She had been carrying it in the front pocket of her backpack, and she took it out when Lenny asked if there was anything else. It was a photograph of a man on a motorcycle. Taken from the side, the man's face turned toward the camera, in a 3/4 profile. He was in his late 30s in the photograph, lean, with the kind of face that has decided to be what it is and stopped negotiating about it. He was wearing a cut. Lenny looked at the photograph for a long time. He said, "How old are you in this picture? Do you know?" Rosie looked at it. "I wasn't born yet," she said. "Dad said it was a long time ago." Lenny turned it over. On the back, in different handwriting than the note, older, fainter, the ink brown at the edges, someone had written a name and a year. The name was not the name Rosie had given him. The year was 1987. Lenny took the photograph to the main room, and he showed it to the 5 men there, and nobody recognized the face, and nobody recognized the name on the back either. And then D pointed at the wall. The photographs on the wall ran from 1971 to the present in rough chronological order, the older ones to the left and the newer ones to the right, and the section that covered 1985 to 1992 was a cluster of maybe 20 images. Some group shots and some individual. The colors faded to the particular warmth of photographs from that era. Lenny went to that section. He went through them one by one. The 4th one from the left was a group shot. 8 men in front of the old clubhouse building before the renovation. 7 of the faces Lenny did not know. They predated him. One of them, at the left edge of the group, was the face from the photograph in his hand. Younger, maybe 22, 23, but the same face, the same way of having decided. He looked at the back of the group photograph. The names were listed in pencil, left to right. He found the name at the left edge. It was not the name Rosie had given him. It was a different name, a name that was 2 parts. The first of which Lenny knew because it was a chapter name, a road name, the kind given by the Brotherhood rather than registered at birth. He went back to the kitchen. He sat down across from Rosie. He held the group photograph toward her. "Do you see your dad?" he said. Rosie looked at it carefully. She pointed. "Left edge." "That's him," she said. Lenny looked at the name written in pencil at the left edge of the back. He looked at the name Rosie had given him, her father's legal name, the name on the birth certificate, the name she had grown up knowing. He put the two together. He sat with that for a moment. He said, very carefully, "Rosie, where is your dad right now?" She looked at the chocolate milk. "He's in the hospital," she said. "He said he might not come home this time." The kitchen was very quiet. "He told me," she said, "that if he didn't, I should come here. He told me about 3 weeks ago." She paused. She straightened the crackers on the plate in a careful line, which was what she did when she was holding something that was too large to hold directly. "He said you were good men. He said you would know what to do." Lenny looked at the photograph. He said, "Rosie, can I ask, did your dad ever talk to you about why he moved away from Roanoke a long time ago?" She thought about it. "He said he made some mistakes," she said. "He said the men here were the best men he ever knew. He said he didn't deserve them anymore." She looked at the photograph on the table. He kept this picture his whole life, though. His name, his legal name, the name Rosie had grown up knowing, was Thomas Callahan. His road name, given to him by the Roanoke chapter in 1986, when he was 22 years old and had been prospecting for 8 months with a seriousness that impressed men twice his age, had been Slate. He had been a full member for 4 years. He had been gone from the chapter since 1991, which was before anyone currently in the Roanoke chapter had joined, which was why no one had recognized the face or the name. What had happened in 1991 was not simple, and it was not entirely Thomas's fault, and it was not entirely not his fault, which is the nature of most things that cause a man to leave the place he belongs. He had been 27. There had been a situation and a choice, and he had made the choice that he made, and when it was over, he had understood that he could not stay, and he had left, and he had taken the photograph with him. He had moved west. He had cleaned himself up in the way that people clean themselves up when the alternative is a very short future. Not quickly, not painlessly, but completely. He had built a life in Flagstaff, Arizona, which was far enough from Roanoke that the distance did his work for him in the years when his own willpower was not sufficient. He had married a woman named Carol who had known what she was getting, and had stayed anyway for 13 years, until a different kind of goodbye. He had raised Rosie alone since she was 3. He had kept the photograph on the dresser in his bedroom for 32 years. He had told Rosie it was from when he was young and had belonged to something good. He had not told her more than that until the oncologist in Flagstaff had given him the number that told him the shape of what was coming, at which point he had told her everything. He had told her in the particular careful way that a parent tells a child a true and difficult thing, not all at once, not in a single sitting, but over several weeks, in pieces, each piece followed by enough time for the child to absorb it and bring her questions back. Rosie had a lot of questions. She had gotten through most of them. The one thing he had done in those several weeks was draw the map on the back of the envelope and explain the address and drive the route slowly and make her memorize the turns. And he had told her, "These men are good. I know this because I was one of them once, and because the best parts of who I became came from what they taught me, even though I left. If you need help, real help, the kind you cannot find anywhere else, go to that gate and say your name and tell them your dad sent you." She had said, What if they don't remember you? He had said, they will know what to do. That is who they are. They will know. Lenny called the chapter president at 8:15. His name was Roy Adkins, and he listened to the full account without interrupting. And when Lenny was done, Roy said, "I'll be there in 20 minutes." He was there in 14. He read the name on the back of the group photograph. He looked at the year. He went to the filing cabinet in the back room. The chapter kept records, the kind that accumulate over decades, and that nobody has organized, but that nobody has thrown away either. And he went through the folders from 1986 to 1992 until he found what he was looking for. He read it. He sat down. He read it again. He came back out to the main room with the folder in his hand, and he stood in front of the men there. There were 9 by now, members who had gotten Roy's call and come in, and he said, "Here is what I found." He told them about Thomas Callahan, about Slate, about the 4 years and the 1991 situation, and what Thomas had done, and what it had cost him, and what he had done with the years after. He told them about the oncologist in Flagstaff and the envelope with the map. He told them what Thomas had written on the back. "These are good men. They will know what to do." The room was quiet for a long time. One of the men, a man named Vic, who had been with the chapter for 7 years, said he thought we'd remember him. Roy said he hoped we would. "I don't think he counted on it," Vic said. He sent his daughter to men he hadn't seen in 30 years because he believed we were still who we were when he knew us. Nobody said anything. Rosie was in the kitchen with Dee, who had given her a second glass of chocolate milk and was teaching her a card trick that he had been teaching his own grandchildren, and the sound of her asking him to show her again came through the doorway into the main room, and several of the men looked at the doorway when they heard it. Roy looked at the folder in his hand. He said, "The question is whether we are." There was a conversation that night. Not a formal meeting. There was no motion, no vote, no procedure. There was a group of men in a room deciding together who they wanted to be, which is the oldest form of meeting and the only one that matters. What they decided was this. Thomas Callahan had been Slate. He had been theirs. Once, he had left. He had left wrong, and he knew it, and the fact that he still called himself one of theirs, privately, in an envelope map he drew for his daughter. That was the thing. You could argue about what he'd done in 1991. You could not argue about the photograph on the dresser for 32 years. He had sent his daughter here because he believed they were still good men. The least they could do was be good men. Roy called the hospital in Flagstaff at 9 o'clock. He got a nurse, and then a doctor, and then a hospital administrator, and at each level he explained who he was and why he was calling, which required more explaining at each level than the level before. He got through to Thomas Callahan's room at 9:45. Thomas answered on the 3rd ring. His voice was not the voice of a well man, but it was present, and it was his. Roy said, "This is Roy Adkins. Roanoke chapter. Your daughter is here." A long silence. "Is she all right?" Thomas said. "She's fine," Roy said. "She's drinking chocolate milk and learning a card trick." Another silence. "I wasn't sure you'd open the gate," Thomas said. "We opened the gate," Roy said. A very long silence. "I'm sorry," Thomas said, "for what happened. I've been sorry for a long time." Roy looked at the main room where 9 men were waiting. "We know," he said. "That's not why we're calling." He told Thomas what they had decided. He told it plainly, without performance, the way you tell someone something that has been decided and is not going to change. When he was done, Thomas was quiet again. Then he said, I told her you were good men. I told her that her whole life. Roy said, "You were right." The chapter president of the Roanoke chapter flew to Flagstaff the following Wednesday. He did not go alone. 4 members came with him, including Lenny, including Dee, and a man named Pete who had been in the chapter for 26 years and who had found, in the filing cabinet records, that he had spent 3 weeks as a prospect in 1991 alongside a man named Slate before the situation occurred, and Slate was gone. And who had thought of that man perhaps 4 times in 26 years, and who had spent the 48 hours since Roy's announcement thinking of nothing else. They went to the hospital. They spent 2 hours with Thomas Callahan, who was smaller than his photograph and larger than his situation, and who talked about the chapter, about what it had meant to him, about the years after, about Rosie, with the particular openness of a man who has made peace with a long accounting and is on the other side of it now, and can speak about it without the weight of the shame, which had been the heaviest thing, and which he had apparently set down somewhere in the last few years, without making an announcement about it. Lenny had brought the group photograph, the 1987 original, retrieved from the wall. He put it on Thomas's bed table. Thomas looked at it for a long time. He looked at the faces. He put his finger on the face at the left edge. "I was so sure about everything that year," he said. "All that confidence." He shook his head, not with bitterness, with the particular fond exasperation of a man looking at a version of himself he has outgrown. "I was an idiot. But I loved it. I loved being one of you," Lenny said. "You were one of us." Thomas looked at him. "You don't have to. You were one of us," Lenny said again. Quietly, plainly, the way you say a thing that is simply true and does not require qualification. Thomas was quiet. He looked at the photograph. "Does Rosie know you came?" he said. "She's the reason we came," Roy said. Rosie Callahan flew back to Roanoke 3 weeks later. She did not fly alone. A woman named Carla, who was the partner of one of the chapter members and who worked as a social worker for the city, had been in contact with the relevant people in Flagstaff and in Roanoke since the Thursday evening at the gate. And by the time Thomas Callahan died on a Sunday morning in November, the path for Rosie had been mapped in more detail than the envelope in her jacket pocket, and the men who were going to walk it with her had been decided. She was not going into the system. Roy had seen to that, through channels that took 3 weeks to navigate and required the specific kind of patient, relentless institutional engagement that Roy Adkins had spent 30 years developing, and that he deployed on Rosie's behalf with everything he had. She would stay with a family in the chapter, a family with a daughter 3 years older than Rosie, who had already, over the phone, decided that Rosie was going to be taught the same card trick that Dee had taught her, and several more besides. It was not a perfect arrangement. There is no perfect arrangement for a child who has lost her father at 8 years old. There is only the arrangement that is better than the alternative, and the people willing to make it work, and the willingness itself, which is the thing that makes arrangements into care. Rosie Callahan grew up in Roanoke, Virginia. She went to the same middle school and high school that the daughter of her foster family attended, and she was in those schools long enough that the teachers knew her by her 2nd year and looked forward to her. She went to Virginia Tech on a scholarship that the chapter had quietly funded in the way that certain chapters fund certain things, without announcement, without requirement of gratitude, as the natural expression of a commitment that had been made on a Thursday evening in October when a man named Roy Adkins had said, "The question is whether we are." She became a social worker. This surprised no one who had met her and met Lenny and understood how certain things travel from one generation to the next through ways that are not blood. She kept the group photograph, not the copy, the original, The one from the wall, which the chapter had voted unanimously to give her on the day she left for college. Framed, with a small plaque below it that had been Lenny's idea and that said, "These are good men." It sat on her desk through her career, in every office she worked in every city. It was not decorative. It was a reminder. Her father told her that strangers could be trusted. He told her this when she was 8 years old and he was dying, and he needed her to believe it because her life was going to depend on it. He drew a map on the back of an envelope. He said, "Go to these men. They will know what to do." He had not spoken to any of them in 30 years. He had no reason to believe they were still who they were when he left. He had the photograph on his dresser and the 4 years of his life when he had been one of them, and the knowledge derived from that and sustained across 3 decades of being away, that what a chapter is, truly is, underneath the road and the patches and the years, does not expire. He was right. He sent his daughter to a gate. They opened it. They did what they were asked. They did more than they were asked, which is what good men do when the asking is small and the need is large, and the person doing the asking is 8 years old and trusting them with everything. He told her they were good men. He was right. If this story reached you, if you believe that faith placed in good people is rarely misplaced, share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight. Subscribe so you never miss the next story. And drop a comment below. Has a stranger ever showed up for you exactly when you needed them? Tell me what happened. I read every single one. Never found out what it meant to them? Or been the stranger who was helped and never got to say thank you? Type row in the comments if this one stayed with you.